Alright, so this particular video is to show you how to use variables in JavaScript. And yes, I did pick a pretty Zen-ish, background music this time. So you can call this the Zen of JavaScript programming, or Node.js for that purpose. Alright, so I'm going to show you guys how to get started, using just a browser. You don't even need to connect to a power server or any computer, or to have Node.js installed on your system. Because remember, JavaScript and Node.js are basically the same programming language. The only difference is one is intended for what the client-side scripting in the browser, and then the other one is intended for server-side scripting to generate the HTML documents that a browser can display. All right, so having that said, let's go to, this is in Firefox, so if you're using Chrome, it's going to be a little bit different. I can even show that in just a little bit. Let me show you how to do it in Firefox first. So you go to the hamburger, and then you go down to more tools, and then after you get to more tools, you go to web developer tools, and you can also use Control-Shift-I to get into this particular screen, which we have already done when we talked about values and types in JavaScript or Node.js. So this is how we do it in Firefox. Now let me see if I can show you also how to do this in Google Chrome, because I think some people have Google Chrome, some people have JavaScript, and no matter which, it doesn't matter which one you have, they both have the same kind of tools with a very similar interface. So I'm just resizing my Google Chrome on the where you cannot see, and I'm gonna put it here. Okay, perfect. You can actually see the entire thing. So once again, go to the ... or the Chrome, I mean the hamburger, and in this case I think you can go to more tools, and you can't see what is off screen now, but there's also a developer tools. Okay, let me resize the window so you can actually see the entire thing. There we go. So click on the hamburger or the three dots, go to more tools, and then you can go to developer tool, and the shortcut key is the same as Firefox, which is Control-Shift-I. So once you click that, you get into a very similar interface. I wouldn't say it's exactly the same, but it's very similar. The point is you also have a console here, which is where you can do all the experimentation, and we can close what's new, because I don't really care, not for this particular exercise. So now we have a way to get into the console in Google Chrome, and also using a very similar method, Control-Shift-I, you can get into the same thing in Firefox. Alright, having that said, I'm gonna resize the window so I can actually show you more text than the other way. So there we go. And I'm gonna turn back on the time and also my face. Okay, the time is important because when you're taking notes, you can actually take a note of the actual real time, and then you can search through the video for that. If you take notes, okay, and you basically note and say, okay, at a particular time text starts to talk about blah blah blah, then you can have a little bit of an index yourself, to get back to the important topics if you need to. So that's just kind of what I think people can do to best utilize the recorded lectures, or basically lecurettes, because these are miniature lectures. My typical lectures are 80 minutes long. Okay, and I know if it's not synchronous, where people can interact and ask me questions and I can answer questions, if it's not interactive and it's just one way, most people don't want 80-minute long lectures. But if I cut it down to smaller portions, like maybe 40 minutes, maybe half an hour, maybe even 20 minutes, that's probably more manageable to most people. All right, excellent. So now we're gonna, kind of get rid of the other screen pretty much altogether, because we don't really need it. And we can now, start with this prompt here. So, the first thing I want to show you guys is the concept of a scope. Okay, so in JavaScript, you can use open curly brace and close curly brace. I know you guys remember this because we use these two, to create objects, right? So with an object, we have a name, a colon, and then a value, for each member of the object. However, this is also used to create what we call statement blocks or block statements. So a block statement is basically a statement. Console.log, with parentheses and then something to print, is a statement. So with the curly braces, we can now group multiple statements into a block. Now, before we get into conditional statements, loops, and stuff like that, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to have blocks. So I'm just going to be touching on this because I need to talk about scopes. Okay, so let's see if it will let me just have an open curly brace, and that's okay. All right. Well, I haven't really done this before using an interactive console, with JavaScript. So this is perfect. Okay, so now we can say console.log, and we can just print whatever we want. Okay, so we can print hello world, and press the enter key. And oh, okay, I forgot to close. Okay, so let's go ahead and close that string with a double quote because I forgot to do so. Double quote, and the editor is trying to be smart about this, except it doesn't work in this case. And then we press the enter key, and you go like, but why is it not displaying anything? I thought this is going to display, hello world. That's because we haven't closed the scope yet. Okay, and in interactive mode, before you close the scope, JavaScript does not execute anything. Alright, so let's go ahead and close this scope and then press the enter key, and now we have hello world. Alright, this is nothing new. We have done this before, except for the braces, right? Open curly brace to start a block, close curly brace to end a corresponding block. So curly braces are like parentheses. It can nest. Okay, so it's really kind of cool. Okay, but at this point, it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to have to nest things. But what I do want to show you is the scope of variables. Okay, and we'll start with just variables first. Now, if you remember in one of the earlier examples, we have strict on in quotes and use strict, sorry, not strict on, use strict in double quotes and then a semicolon, and then press the enter key. It doesn't seem to do much, except this actually instructs the interpreter to be more strict about how we declare and use variables. So now the next question is, what is a variable? Well, as the name implies, a variable is something that can change. See, code in Node.js cannot change. Unlike some really weird programming language like Lisp, it can self-modify the program itself. The program can self-modify itself, but JavaScript, like most other programming languages, doesn't let people do that. So your code is kind of rigid. Once it is typed in and once the program is running, you can't really change the structure of the program. However, variables, which are used to hold values, they can change over time. All right, so I'm going to give you a very interesting, well, not so interesting example right now. In most scripting languages, including PHP and JavaScript, if you don't specify use strict, you can start to use a variable out of the blue and just say, I want to use this variable called X right now. And you can create a variable on the fly just like that. But right now, we can't do that. Okay, so if I just say, X equals to 1, and I'll explain what that means, in just a little bit, and press the enter key, it actually let me do it. That is not what use strict is supposed to do. Okay, so we are not actually using strict for now. Let me take a quick look on the side and make sure that I got the right syntax. Yep, the syntax is right, except in this case it doesn't work because I'm inside the console, of Firefox. All right, well, that's okay. But now the variable X exists, okay? It does not need to be declared again. Now, let me go back to the earlier point here, okay? Let's go back to this statement, where this line is located, x equals 1. For those of you who are math inclined, you might look at this and say, are we comparing x to 1 and see whether x equals to 1 or not? Now that hopefully reminds you of something that we have already talked about, the equality check operator, the equal operator. That is used to check whether a value equals to another value or not. A single equal symbol in just about any programming language these days means assignment operation. So what is assignment operation? Assignment operation has two parts. The first part is to evaluate the right-hand side. So in this case, the right-hand side of the assignment is kind of simple, right? It's just 1. Okay, let me just retype it so that I can use my cursor to highlight what I'm talking about. This one here is called the right-hand side of an assignment. It is basically providing a value, okay? And then on the other side, which is called obviously the left-hand side of an assignment, is something that can change. So if you think about something that can change and the term variable, okay, so we can use a variable on the left-hand side because the value of a variable can change. So in this case, we first evaluate the right-hand side, and then we use whatever value the right-hand side has to change the value of the left-hand side, whatever is specified on the left-hand side. That seems pretty simple, right? So what we're going to do now is to use a statement x equals x plus 1. All right, so x equals x plus 1, once again, is an assignment operation. The right-hand side is x plus 1, and then the left-hand side is simply x. So some people may think, looking at this and go like, but this is going to be circular, because once x is updated, then we are going to go back and reevaluate x plus 1, and then it's going to change x again, and then we go back to the right-hand side. No. That is not what happens, okay? With an assignment operation, it's a one-shot deal. We evaluate the right-hand side once, and it is the first operation. Whatever value that ends up with is going to be used to change the left-hand side, and we are done with this operation. All right, so right now x has a value of 1, okay, because this is what the previous assignment operation does. So x is 1, and then we have 1 plus 1 being 2, and that's why the right-hand side now has a value of 2. That value in return is used to update whatever is specified on the left-hand side. The fact that I'm using the same variable on the left-hand side and referencing the same variable on the right-hand side, that's perfectly okay, because once we evaluate the right-hand side, we are done with the right-hand side. So the right-hand side just gives us a value to update the left-hand side. So after this operation, x is going to end up with a value of 2. Okay, now this 2 here and this 1 here, they are technically not reflecting the value of x per se. It is actually reflecting the value of the entire expression, because x gets x plus 1 is considered an expression that has a value of whatever is used to update the variable. Oh, okay, hold on a second here. What do you mean by that is an expression? Does that mean that we can use the value of that expression to assign to yet another variable? The answer is yes. So you can actually daisy chain stuff, something like this. Okay, so you can say y equals x equals 3. Because what happens here is x equals 3 becomes its own expression, returning a value of 3, because that is the value being used to update this particular assignment. That value of 3 then in return is used to update y. So let's check this out. Okay, press the enter key, and now we want to use console.log to examine the value of y. It is indeed 3. And then we also want to use console.log to check the value of x. It is also 3 at this time. All right. So that means you can use this particular mechanism to initialize multiple variables on the same line. Excuse me. And I find that to be kind of cool. So we have just used this particular example to illustrate that a variable can hold a value that is a numerical value. Remember, there are other types of values. Okay, so in terms of simple values, there's string, which is basically text information. There's Boolean, which is basically just true or false. And then with the composite types, we have arrays, and also we have objects. So I'm not going to demonstrate, the case of string or the Boolean values, because that's about the same as numerical values. However, when we use variables to store an array, that becomes kind of useful. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and say, what if I change the value of x to contain the literal array of 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, let's change that, because because what I'm about to do with it can be confusing when it comes to this. So let's go ahead and use an array of strings. Okay, so I'm gonna put in cars that I personally like. Okay, so there's the MX5, which is a Miata, and then the MR2 and SI type R, and that's it. Okay, so this is an array of 3 strings, namely MX5, MR2, and SIR. And this is an array because we can see the use of brackets, the square brackets, and that indicates that we are creating an array on the fly and then assign that to x. So x, after this assignment, is now an array of 3 items. Now, if you remember, we can also use the bracket notation with an integer inside to designate which item in an array do we want to access. Because a lot of times you don't want to access the entire array, you just want one of the items, one of the elements in an array. So we can try that, right? We can say console.log and then x, which refers to the entire array. But this time I'm going to use square bracket here to specify exactly which element I want to access in the array of x. So let's say I use the index of 1. So now you might want to kind of think about this a little bit and say, okay, so which item in the array is it going to print to the console? Is it MX5 or is it MR2? We kind of know the SIR is not going to be one of those, because that's item, when we count it, we say it's item number 3, but when you use indexes to specify which item inside an array, that would be index 2, because we start counting from 0. So that kind of gives away the answer, right? Because this one, MX5, is at index 0, MR2 is the one that is at index 1. So when we press the enter key, it prints MR2. All right. So we can use a variable to store an array, and you can see, if we basically are doing exactly the same thing as in the previous lecture, in terms of indexing, except this time it is, in an array. So let's do something even more fancy now. Okay, I'm going to use variable z to store the integer value of 1. There we go. And now I can say console.log. And now I can say x square bracket, and in the square bracket I specify z. So this means you can use a variable just about at any place that you can expect a value. So because we can expect an integer, we can expect an integer inside the square bracket, that means we can also refer to variables that are storing a numerical value in the square bracket. And outside of the square bracket, we can use a literal array, which also means that we can use a variable that is storing an entire array at a time. So when we press the enter key, it prints exactly the same thing, which is MR2. So this is really kind of interesting. All right. So I'm going to give you an example of how arrays are really, really useful. Okay. Because there are a lot of shorthands you can do in JavaScript to make use of an array. So we have an array X. So let's just say that we want to create a string that is comma separated with the 3 items in this particular array X. In most other languages, including C, C++, and possibly Java, you're going to have to use a loop, and then you're going to have to do some kind of fancy stuff to make it happen. Not so much in JavaScript. Okay, in JavaScript, this is pretty easy to do. So I can say console.log, I refer to X, and X as an array actually has a lot of methods already defined. One of those methods is called join. So once again, a method is a subroutine that is a member belonging to a particular object. So X, which is a variable containing an array, which actually is an object in disguise, has a method called join. So inside join, you basically just have to specify what separator you want to use to separate a string that has all the items in a particular array. And then when we press the enter key, we can now see that, oh, okay, so we can generate mx5, mr2, and SIR as an array and as a string, but that string has everything, all the items separated by a comma. And some of you may be thinking, how is this going to help us in this particular class when we need to generate HTML, content? Well, let me show you this. Okay, so we can now say console.log x dot. Okay, and you can even explore what you can do with an array. Okay, you can actually search on the internet about any one of these methods, and one method is called map. So I'm going to select map here. Map is interesting because map allows you to take every item in an array, change it slightly, and then you basically end up with a different array, and then you can do whatever you want with the different array. Now this is fairly advanced stuff, okay? So I'm only demonstrating it so that you can be more convinced that we chose the right scripting language here. So I'm going to show you this, but without really explaining a whole lot, okay? So I'm gonna say, let's not use Z because we have used that earlier. Not that it's going to cause a problem. So we have E, and then we return backtake li, which is the list item tag, and then we refer to E, and then we have the end tag of line item. And guess what? I'm going to even be nice and throw in a line feed character here. And the backtick, the close backtick is already here. And now we can okay, so now we can close the map. Okay, it doesn't like it, so something else is expected here. I might need curly braces around here. I don't think so, but I'll just be careful. Put parentheses around that. Okay, that seems to be okay. So what is... Okay, so now I have to get back here. So map is returning an array, and this time it is an array with the line list item, and then each item, in X, and then the close tag for list item. So with that array, I can now say join, and I don't really need anything to join it, well, yeah, so I can just say join with an empty string, like so, and then we can close the console log. Alright, so I think this is going to work, and you can see, oh, we can now generate the list items based on the content in the array that has mx5, mr2, and SIR. And this is all done without using quote-unquote actual control structures. So there's no for loop, there's no while loop, nothing, okay? These are all based on two of the methods, that we have associated with the type array. Once again, this is fairly advanced stuff, but it does show you the kind of cool stuff you can do in JavaScript. All right, next we got objects, right? So we got to get back to objects. So this time I'm gonna say W is an object, and objects start with open curly brace. So now we're gonna say, well, let's use the previous example, which is last name colon and then you give it a string, as the value of last name, and this time it is Aoyoung, and then use a comma to separate from the next member, which is going to be first name. Oh, I don't really need quotes for the names, for the member names. You can use quotes when you need to do something that is that's not that has a space or some other characters that you normally cannot have. So in this case, we are not dealing with those cases. So I'm just gonna make this simple. It has my last name and has my first name. So now that W is an object, we can do all kinds of stuff that we normally can do with an object. And the first thing, the most important thing you can do with an object is you can designate which member you want to access. So when we can do a console.log, and in console.log we can say, since W is an object, we can now say dot, which is apostrophe S, and then we say we want to access the member called first name. Okay, so there we go, and then we press the enter key and it prints tag, because tag is the value of the member of first name of this particular object, and the object is now assigned to W, so W is the object now. So you might be asking, what else can we do with an object? Well, actually, there's a lot of stuff we can do with objects. We're only touching, the surface of what objects can do, and objects are very different compared to arrays. Objects are not intended so that you can access the items using an integer, and instead, there are other methods to access different members of an object in JavaScript. So let me go ahead and look into the methods in a particular object. And one thing we can do is to access an entry. Basically we can access the entries as an array. So let's go ahead and take a look. Nope, I take it back. Well, I think this is a topic we can explore later. Okay, because at this point I'm just looking at the sample code and we don't have enough vocabulary to explore those specific topics. But we can definitely tell that we can now introduce we have just introduced the concept of variables, and we're not quite done yet. Okay, I'm going to use the next few minutes to talk about scoping. So scoping is interesting because it allows you to basically use the same name as a variable, but in different scopes. Okay, basically in different blocks. Okay, it will be referring to different actual variables. So I'm going to give you an example here. So with scoping, the one thing you want to do is now you really want to declare variables using the let keyword. So when you say let, okay, it is defining a variable within that specific scope. And you can have a variable in a different scope already. So in this case, I'm going to reintroduce variable x, but because this variable x is within this particular scope, it is actually not the same as the x that already existed, because we already have x here as an array of the cars that I like. So now we can introduce x here as just an integer with a value of 2, and then we press the enter key. Oh, okay, I need to, nope, it doesn't let me define a inner scope. And let me see if I can do this, x equals 3. Okay, uncaught syntax error. Yeah, it won't let me put in an inner scope inside the editor here. So for this example, I might actually need to use an installed Node.js. simply because it won't let me. Oh, okay, control, a shift enter seems to work. So we'll take a look. Okay, let x equals 3. And then we have console.log x over here. And then we have console.log x over here. And then we'll put one right after this. Okay, so console.log x. Alright, so we have 3 console.log x. The first one is right after the declaration of x equals 2 in the outermost block, and then the second one is right after we declare x in the inner block, and then the third one is after we exit the inner block when we are back to the outer block. So this particular console.log should print 2 because this particular definition of x is inside the scope, and it is quote-unquote hiding the other x, which is the array of cars that I like. The second console.log x is going to print this value of 3 because it is hiding both the x of the outer scope of the and also the x that is quote-unquote global, which is the one that we defined much earlier. And then the third one is going to get back to this 2 here. I think that's what I just said. So it should print 2, 3, and 2. So let's see whether that works or not. Yep, so it is 2, 3, and 2. Alright, so that does work out. So the key to kind of test this inside inside the developer option inside the browser is to use Shift Enter and not just Enter, because if you use just Enter, JavaScript may decide to evaluate the whole thing first instead of giving you a new line to type something. But if you use Shift Enter, it gives you a new line within the code that you're still typing. Now, as our examples get more and more complicated, it becomes more and more troublesome to do it this way. So at some point we're going to have to go back to Node.js and use an editor to actually type in the code, and then we test run the code. But at this point, it is still manageable to do it this way. So I'm going to throw in one last thing before we end this kind of short lecture, is I'm going to print x again. But now we are actually out of this block entirely, right? So do we still have an x to print? The answer is yes, we still have an x, because very long ago up here we actually assigned x to mx5, mr2, and SIR. That particular x is called a global variable because it is defined in the global scope. Okay, if it's not inside a curly brace block, it is considered global. This one is still around. So when I print, when I do a console.log x, it is just re-accessing the one in the global scope. Okay. Yes, I did promise that this is the last thing I wanted to say, but there's one more. I kind of lied. Okay, so the very last thing I want to say is try not to use global variables. Okay, you cannot avoid using global variables altogether most of the time. Okay, if you can, don't use global variables. Okay, because global variables have a global scope, which means they can be accessed from any scope within the entire program. Now, it may not seem like a very bad idea right now, but once we introduce the concept of a subroutine, initially, even after that, people would say, that's kind of convenient. I kind of like this idea. I don't have to pass a whole bunch of stuff into the subroutine. But as the program gets more and more complicated, global variables can lead to extremely difficult to find bugs. And that's a story to tell after we introduce the concept of subroutines. So today we are gonna, well, at least with this lecture, we are gonna conclude with this particular example. Basically, we're just saying, oh, whatever we can do with values. Remember, Boolean values, numerical values, text or string values, array values, and object values. we can actually use a variable to store that value, and then the variable can also do all of those things that we talked about in the previous lecture. So that's the takeaway from today's, from this specific lecture. All right, so don't forget to do the homework assignment. It is due on Monday, okay, anytime on Monday, next Monday. And then we are going to have some additional homework assignments after that. And the complexity of the assignments is going to increase because we are just ramping up. Remember, we basically, well, I shouldn't say lost. I was about to say lost, but we didn't lose 4 weeks, okay? But we are starting out with this new programming language, which does bear resemblance to PHP in many, many ways. But we are gonna ramp up to the point where we can start to generate HTML documents, parse, the parse forms. Once a form is submitted, we want to be able to parse the get or the post request, and then we want to deal with MySQL and so on and so forth. So we are ramping up quickly after this kind of rather gentle introduction to JavaScript and Node.js. All right, so until the next lecture. See ya.